Okay, I know what you're thinking. In what world could Shrek of all things have a queer legacy? It's about a pair of ogres and a talking donkey. I won't deny that, on the surface, there is nothing queer at all about Shrek. Sure, you could make an argument that Fiona's storyline in the first movie, where she hides her true self, comes out to Donkey and then Shrek, and ultimately becomes happy with who she is queer coding, but I'm not going to argue that. You can make any number of interpretations about any work you choose. That is what Death of the Author is. But without textual evidence, even if these interpretations really resonate with you, they are, at the end of the day, just interpretations. But what if I told you that Shrek also has two explicitly LGBT characters whose presence have provided insight into the cultural context of each Shrek movie's release, and that even as far back as in 2004, people were arguing over their inclusion? I am referring, of course, to the ugly stepsisters, Doris and Mabel. Doris, voiced by Larry King, appears in Shrek 2, Shrek the Third, and Shrek Forever After, whereas Mabel, voiced by Regis Philbin, only appears in Shrek the Third and Shrek Forever After. Make no mistake, Doris is explicitly transgender. The Fairy Godmother's Factory shows a bunch of before and after portraits, and one such pair includes Doris pre and post transition. It's really easy to miss, though. How do we know that this egg isn't just an Easter egg? Quite frankly, we only need to look at how Doris is treated in the movie to understand the intent. The framing of Doris's first scene in Shrek 2 is meant to be shocking. Now, I want to say before I continue, I did run this by a friend who had a bit of a different read, that the shock is actually foreshadowing because this is the privileged king who transformed from a frog into a human. I don't know that I agree with that. I think it's meant to be shocking because, oh, wow, that's a man, bro. But you can absolutely make that argument. In Far, Far Away Idol, Fiona is unsure if Doris is actually a woman, and she also has a bunch of masculine traits. She has stubble, she has large hands, she has an Adam's apple, and she has a deep voice. Now, these are all things cis women can have, but they're still used as the target for transphobic humor and worse, regularly. Doris also throws herself at Prince Charming in the ending, quite literally, which is meant to be a funny punishment for him, while also showing lack of boundaries regarding consent. That is another transphobic stereotype. So, as much as I love Shrek 2, I think it's pretty explicit that Doris is meant to be a caricature of a trans woman. But also, if that's all there is, end of story, this video wouldn't be very long. Shrek 2 came out in 2004, which was more than 20 years ago at this point. In fact, several of the students I teach are younger than that, and I'd assume quite a few viewers are as well. Unfortunately, transphobia in television and film was very common back then, and we only ended up seeing progress away from that and into our federal governments in the 2010s. With that in mind, you probably wouldn't expect Doris to have been controversial, but you'd be wrong. Conservatives threw a fit about the inclusion of a gender nonconforming character in a kids' movie, even using arguments you still hear today. Think of the children! This is a fetish! The gays have gone too far! All that fun stuff. Isn't that something? The mere appearance of a trans character in a children's movie was enough to convince these people to boycott Shrek. The viewers were meant to laugh at Doris in the same way conservatives love to, but they still missed the point entirely. Shrek 2 loves making jokes about anyone who's gender nonconforming. Fairy Godmother calls the big bad wolf a gender-confused wolf in a derogatory manner. And there's the whole joke about Pinocchio wearing ladies' underwear. So why would Doris be any different? Granted, there is an argument to be made that they didn't miss this point, but a completely different one instead. Shrek, as a franchise, is all about tolerance and accepting others who are different from you. So, of course, one of the characters in the series is going to be trans. And to be fair, the sequel does treat Doris better. Doris is more of a villain, maybe an anti-villain in Shrek 2, but in Shrek the Third, she is now unambiguously on the side of good. Thus, she's invited to Fiona's baby shower and treated as just one of the girls, with an asterisk. There are still jokes made at her expense. In fact, she has a bigger role in this movie, so there are actually even more jokes about her than there were in Shrek 2. Snow White makes a crack that could be taken as her not considering Doris a woman, and she and Rapunzel are both disgusted when Doris talks about how Prince Charming makes her hot. Likewise, they make jokes about how Doris has manly hands, which is one of J.K. Rowling's favorite tactics, and they also make jokes about Doris's strength overall. Which is also funny because if you look at any social media ever, you'll see that strong women are typically considered anything but undesirable. But that's another story. Even with all this, none of that changes she is a hero in the movie. She contributes to the woman's B-plot. Ultimately, no one questions her presence. She helps save the day. And she's allowed to be an actual character with traits beyond just being trans. Just like real human beings. Mabel, the other ugly stepsister, has a similar role to Doris's from Shrek 2, acting as a bartender and being considered a villain up until the ending. So, yeah, these portrayals are still a mixed bag. But they're still much more positive than Shrek 2's. Perhaps that's why there is an even louder conservative outcry about Doris's presence in Shrek the Third. Still, the question remains. All things considered, how should we view Doris and Mabel? Are they jokes to be laughed at? Actual people with their own wants and lives? Something in the middle? If you look up anything about them today, you'll find the online LGBT community has widely adopted them, especially Doris. They have plenty of fans. At the same time, there are detractors who believe they're not the best characters to represent us for completely valid reasons. So, to answer how we should view Doris and Mabel, I would like to instead take a step back and ask a different question first. Why do we still remember and talk about these two so many years later? Why do they still have so many fans when other popular movies from that time period would instead have similar characters treated as a dark moment in their history? Well, to answer that, I think we need to look at the Shrek series as a whole. The first movie is about refusing to conform to society's expectations. Shrek clearly doesn't enjoy how he's seen by the townsfolk, and the isolation of his swamp, as much as he'll argue otherwise, is terrible for him. He ultimately finds companionship in Donkey, another outcast, and Fiona, whom he loves regardless of her dark secret. That she turns into an ogre at night before ultimately becoming one 24/7. That's right, I lied about not discussing the plot's queer coding. What are you gonna do? The second movie adds on to this message. It's not just about accepting who you truly are, it's about loving someone for who they are, not how they look. This is definitely a major theme in the first movie as seen with Shrek and Fiona's relationship, but Shrek 2 brings it to the forefront. Shrek believes that becoming human, something he's not, and conforming to society will fix his relationship with Fiona while also appeasing her parents. Meanwhile, her father Harold used to be a frog but was transformed into a human, hiding a dark secret of his own from his entire family, including his wife Lillian. But ultimately, Fiona resolves to live happily ever after with the ogre she married. And Lillian doesn't view Harold any differently even when he turns back into a frog, loving him all the same. So, to recap, Shrek is an ogre, an outcast who's been hated by society for something he can't control, and that only changes at the end of the second movie. He loves Fiona for who she is, not how she looks, and this love is consummated and accepted by the very society that once rejected him when they see that he and Fiona are no different from them. Donkey is treated as an outlier, an outcast because he's annoying, not because he's a talking donkey, But when push comes to shove, he is just as lonely and isolated as Shrek, and he still finds love with Dragon. The two of them are different species, but they even have kids together. Donkey and Dragon, like Shrek and Fiona, are in a healthy relationship, and no challenges ever change that. Fiona herself is in an interesting position. She's accepted herself as an ogre at the end of Shrek 1, so she's shocked when she becomes human again in Shrek 2, and she makes it clear she's comfortable with who she is and only wants Shrek to be comfortable too. Then you have Fiona's parents. They don't accept Shrek because he's an ogre, but by the end, they learn to love him as one of their own even before Harold transforms back into a frog and reveals the truth about himself. Shrek, and especially Shrek 2, wants you to know that you will always find love, no matter what form it takes, so long as you're happy and comfortable with yourself. The movie's biggest bigot, the fairy godmother, tries to convince Shrek he doesn't deserve happiness or love because of who he is multiple times, and her unmaking comes immediately after her final line. "I told you, ogres don't live happily ever after." Ironically, she won't live happily ever after, and it's entirely her own fault. If you focus on hating others for who they are, you'll only destroy yourself. If I may pull back from Shrek for a moment, I remember when The Last Jedi came out. A lot of people really hated Rose's line, "That's how we're gonna win, not fighting what we hate, saving what we love." I think that is, regardless, a line that rings true in a lot of contexts. But Shrek 2 really emphasizes just how important that mindset is. In a franchise all about true love, it's incredible that romantic love shares the spotlight with self-love here. And isn't that what Pride's really about? Self-love? You know, I'd really love to go to a far, far away Pride parade now that I think about it. It's gotta be absolutely wild. Now, I could end this part of the essay here, but there happens to be another relevant Shrek film, as much as you may not want to admit it. Shrek the Third continues these themes from the first two, even bringing them to their logical conclusion. This time, there's a much larger focus on Far, Far Away's villains. In Shrek 2, we're led to believe they like being evil and act as villains simply because they can, despite clearly being ostracized from society with what little we see of them. But in Shrek the Third, we're told very quickly that isn't the case. They're all in pain, suffering in their own ways, which Charming takes advantage of to lead a revolution. What's interesting to me about these villains is how they're portrayed. They're absolutely misunderstood, but they also actively choose to continue being evil, to avoid fighting for a better, more accepting society. They're very much normal people. For example, the Cyclops preparing Shrek for his eventual execution is given a humanizing moment when we see his daughter. There's also probably something in here about how easy it is for Charming's brand of populism and hatred to corrupt otherwise normal people who are hurting and turn them into monsters. While that isn't the focus of this essay, I do think it's still important and makes what happens at the end of the movie even more powerful. Once the villains realize they do have a choice to stop being evil and to find their own ways to integrate into society, they all abandon Charming's cause and are accepted back into society with open arms. Artie gives a speech I'd argue is far more poignant than it has any right to be, especially for a movie as often reviled as Shrek the Third. Now, a quick note. This speech is not perfect. I never thought I'd analyze a talking tree, much less agree with one, but Ed makes a good point, which Artie can't dispute. It's hard to come by honest work when the whole world's against you, is something that can resonate with a lot of queer people, and unfortunately, there is no easy answer or solution to that, especially in our current political climate, both in the US and in too many countries around the world. I wrote this entire essay in 2023. Things are only worse now, I'm not going to pretend otherwise. You may not actually be the only person standing in your own way, but standing in your own way gives you an excuse to think poorly of yourself. No matter who you are or what you look like, you need to do all you can to be the person you want to be. Opposition be damned. Now, back to Artie's speech. On one hand, it is strange that this speech is in the same movie that makes fun of Charming for being a little feminine and Doris for being a little masculine. But on the other, this speech really gets to what the core of Shrek is. The main characters are a pair of ogres marginalized by society, yet you still come to see them as people and root for their success and acceptance. Why would a trans woman or a gender confused wolf or Simon Cowell be any different? Oh, yeah, Simon Cowell is canon to Shrek. I didn't have a good segue into this, but I can't just not talk about Far, Far Away Idol. I brought up earlier that yes, there is another joke at Doris's expense in it. That's true, but also there's more to it. Beck and Fiona are both extremely supportive of her nonetheless, cheering as she sings. If the main characters love her enough to root for her and invite her to a baby shower, what other proof do you need? Well, Simon Cowell. He never once questions her gender, instead focusing on insulting her voice and looks, like he does with everyone else. LGBT ally. I've talked a lot about the first 3 Shrek movies, and we'll see if I need to revisit this essay once Shrek 5 comes out next year. But as you know, there is also a 4th. In conclusion, I believe Doris is still popular in part because Shrek is all about acceptance and themes that resonate with a lot of LGBT people. If Shrek and Fiona can be happy and loved by all, if a donkey can find love with a dragon, if villains can find places in the societies that once ostracized them, and, most mundanely, if Doris and Mabel can be happy as who they are and accepted by their companions, then that's something that will rightfully resonate with a lot of people, and nothing can take that away. Now, I do have something else I want to include in this before I wrap up. My friend Kiri was a test reader and gave me a few notes, and I wasn't sure how to integrate some of these into the essay, but I did think they were interesting enough to bring up and at least see if they're worth thinking about for you. First up, I'm just going to directly quote these. Try talking about Mabel more as she's currently hardly relevant. Maybe elaborate the section of the whole Charming sways them over with his 20 charisma roll plot, especially as it's her introduction and she's one of the few singled out when talking about how the heroes have left them to rot. I think every villain still being one at this point, and taking this position as they raid Far Far Away can read as a whole society shapes people thing, as I'm sure they're all pressured to believe they are only reviled, and it takes Artie's speech for both sides to meet in the middle for the most part. I brought up Ed's mention of struggling to find work, and that can be related to how the more privileged, stand in for the cishetes, simply don't give them work because of their reputation. Once the reputation is shattered, only then do the more privileged, in parentheses cishetes, realize the ones they feared are truly no different to them. This was a ramble, but I do think perceived reputation and trying to fight it is a notable theme of 3. I watched Shrek 3 multiple times. This isn't Kiri's speech anymore, this is mine. I watched Shrek 3 multiple times in writing this essay, and while I'm still nostalgic for it, I don't really know how many more times I have it in me, but if you think that that is something that you'd like me to elaborate on or look into covering more, I absolutely would be willing to give it another go. I think that there's a good point there. I wanted to stay focused on my specific topic and primarily on Doris because Mabel is a borderline non-entity. But I do think that there's plenty of room to discuss further, and I'd love to hear from you. Either way, thank you so much for watching. I have been super passionate about this essay for years. This was what I wanted to start my channel with, and I'm glad that I've finally been able to get it out. Hopefully you stick around. Thanks again!